I'd lived next door for 6 years, watching her wear grief like a second skin. We exchanged nods about the weather, nothing more. Then a storm tore down the fence between our pastures. I spent a morning setting new posts. She brought me water, then whispered, "Stay for supper. It's been 10 years since I set a table for someone else." That was when I understood. Her words weren't a meal invitation. They were a crack in a decade of silence. That man was me, Matthew Vale. The scar on my face had turned me into a recluse on a small farm in Wheatland, Oregon. And the woman? Elena Morris, daughter of Albert Morris, the only man who had stood by me when the bank wanted to foreclose. Albert had died 6 months earlier, and now Elena was alone, accused of theft by the town's most powerful woman and hours from homelessness. She didn't need a fence fixed. She needed a life raft. I didn't know it then, but that simple supper would launch us into a fight against false accusations, arson, and a 30-year-old vendetta, and it would test whether two broken people could build a real marriage from an arrangement born of desperation. This is the story of what happened after the table was set. After that supper, I walked her back to the empty house she was about to lose. The lights were off, the room stripped. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my own silence, staring at the ceiling, remembering how I'd become a man who lived in the shadows of a scar. It happened on a Tuesday morning, 6 years before Elena ever stood on my porch. I was 28, still young enough to believe I was invincible. The tractor had been giving me trouble for a week, and I was too stubborn to wait for the repairman. I crawled underneath to loosen a jammed hitch. Something slipped. 1,700 pounds of steel pinned my left side, and the exhaust manifold burned through my shirt and into my skin before I managed to drag myself free. The physical pain lasted months. The social death lasted years. The scar ran from my cheekbone down past my collarbone, puckered and pale, a constant reminder that I'd traded a handsome face for a broken one. Children stared. Women turned away. Men offered me that pitying half-smile that said I'd become an object of relief, glad it wasn't them. I stopped going to town. I stopped answering the phone. I became the man with the scar on the North Farm, and that was fine with me. The soil doesn't judge a man's face. But the bank did judge my finances. With the medical bills and no income, I fell behind on the mortgage. The foreclosure notice arrived on my 30th birthday, a gift from an institution that had no room for sentiment. That was when Albert Morris walked into my life. He was 72, a retired farmer who'd known my parents before the fever took them. He didn't knock. He just opened my door, sat at my kitchen table, and said, "You're not losing this land." The next morning, he stood in the bank manager's office and argued for an hour. He cited my parents' reputation. He cited weather records that had ruined my crop. He cited my accident as an act of God, not negligence. And when the manager hesitated, Albert leaned forward and said, "If you foreclose on that boy, I'll move every account my family has held here for 40 years to the credit union in Salem." The loan was restructured. I had another chance. I never forgot that debt, and I never fully repaid it, not in Albert's eyes, because he refused payment. But 6 months before my fence fell down, Albert died of heart trouble. Funeral was small, and I stood in the back, keeping my scarred face in shadow. Elena gave the eulogy, and I watched her hold herself together for everyone else. I didn't speak to her that day. I didn't know what to say, but I learned later what Albert had done. He'd visited me one last time 3 weeks before he passed. He'd sat under my maple tree, already thin and weak, and he'd made me promise something. He said, "Elena is proud like her mother. She'll starve before she asks for help. When I'm gone, if she's in trouble, you be the one who steps in, even if she fights you," I promised. Then I buried the promise with the man and returned to my quiet, scarred life. Until the storm, until the fence. Until Elena stood on my porch with tears she refused to let fall and whispered the words that would change everything: "Stay for supper." After the meal, she didn't leave right away. She helped me wash the dishes, her hands moving slowly as if she were stalling. I finally asked her what was wrong. And the story spilled out, a story I should have known, a story Albert had tried to prepare me for. Caroline Whitmore. The name tasted bitter the first time Elena said it. Caroline owned the largest estate in the county, old money and old grudges. She had hired Elena as a housekeeper after Albert's death, a position Alina accepted because she had nowhere else to turn. For 2 months, Alina cleaned, cooked, and endured Caroline's constant criticism. Then, 3 days before she came to my porch, Caroline fired her and accused her of stealing a silver bracelet. The accusation spread through Wheatland faster than a grass fire. The landlord, pressured by Caroline's connections, gave Alina until the end of the week to vacate. No job, no reference, no home, and the entire town suddenly whispering that Albert Morris's daughter was a thief. Alina had nothing left but a worn coat and a handful of memories. When she finished speaking, I saw that she expected me to doubt her. That was the cruelest part. She had been judged so thoroughly that she couldn't imagine being believed. So I did the one thing that seemed to shock her most. I told her I believed her without hesitation. And then I said, "You don't have to go back to that empty house tonight. Stay here. We'll figure something out in the morning." That night, as she slept in my spare room, I remembered Albert's words. He hadn't just asked me to help her. He'd known she would need something more permanent than a few nights on a couch. That's when the idea began to form, an arrangement that might protect her legally, that might give her a roof and a future without charity. The next morning, over coffee, I made the offer: marriage, a civil ceremony at the courthouse. She would have my name, my insurance, the legal right to stay on this farm without anyone being able to take it from her. In return, she would help with the garden, the market stall, the house. Separate rooms, separate lives, no strings. Alina stared at me like I'd grown a second head. Then she laughed, a broken, disbelieving sound, and said, "You don't even know me." I answered, "I knew your father, that's enough." She didn't agree immediately. She argued that she had nothing to offer, that she'd be a burden, that I was a recluse and didn't need the town's gossip multiplying because of her. But when she finally looked at my face, really looked, not at the scar but at my eyes, she must have seen something steady. "Monday," she whispered. "The courthouse opens at 9. That gave us 5 days. In those 5 days, I cleaned the house in a way I hadn't bothered with in years. I aired out my mother's old room and put fresh flowers on the dresser. I bought a marriage license. I called Sebastian Cole, an old friend of Albert's, to be a witness. And I watched Alina slowly stop trembling every time she heard a car on the road. Monday morning arrived cold and clear. I shaved for the first time in months, cutting myself twice because my hand wasn't steady. I pulled on a white shirt that still smelled like cedar, black jeans without grease stains, and boots I'd actually polished. Alina came downstairs wearing her mother's dress. It was simple, deep blue with white embroidery, a little loose on her frame, but she walked like a woman who had decided to survive. She saw me and paused. "You look different," she said. "So do you." The drive to the courthouse was silent. We were both terrified and trying not to show it. Outside the building, Sebastian waited with his good Sunday shirt and a combed-over scalp. And beside him stood Rosa, Alina's only remaining friend, who looked at me like she was prepared to commit violence if this turned out to be a trap. The ceremony took less than 10 minutes. A board clerk recited legal statements. When the rings came, I pulled out my mother's silver band, worn at the edges, simple, the only thing I had left of her. I saw Alina's eyes widen and I said, "It was hers, if you don't mind." She held out her left hand. It fit. Then the clerk said the words that hung in the air between us: "You may kiss if you wish." I moved slowly, giving her every chance to step back. She didn't. The kiss lasted barely a second, just a brush of lips, but when I pulled away, Alina's eyes were dark and swimming with something I couldn't name. The clerk stamped the license, hooked the paper into a folder, and said, almost lazily, "Congratulations. You'll want to file the certificate with the county recorder by Thursday. Oh, and you should know, Mrs. Whitmore's attorney was in here last week asking for the list of marriage licenses issued. Seemed particularly interested in any involving former employees of hers." I felt Alina's hand go cold in mine. The walls of the small room seemed to tighten. We were legally married, but the first shadow of the fight ahead had just fallen across our feet. We left the courthouse with a marriage certificate in my pocket and the first ripple of Caroline Whitmore's war already spreading through the county records. Alina sat rigid in the truck beside me, her fingers pressed white against the ring on her left hand. Neither of us spoke for the first mile. Then she whispered, "She's not going to let this stand, is she?" I didn't answer immediately. I was already calculating. Caroline Whitmore moved through Wheatland like an unopposed squall line. I had seen her freeze out a local grocer who refused to give her a discount, watched her pressure the school board into firing a teacher who disciplined her nephew. If she had already sent her lawyer sniffing around our license, she wasn't just nursing a grudge, she was building a case. We need to be seen together, I said, publicly, before she starts defining what this marriage looks like for the town. Alina turned to face me. You mean pretend? I mean refuse to hide. If we look like we're hiding, she'll say we're ashamed. If we look like a unit, she'll have to work harder to tear us apart. The first test came 3 days later at the Saturday farmers market. It was the first time I had set up a stall in nearly 2 years. Before the accident, my produce had a loyal following. After the accident, I couldn't bear the stares. That morning, Alina loaded baskets of winter squash and kale while I hauled the folding table into the truck bed. She had tied her hair back with a blue ribbon and wore one of my flannel shirts over her dress. The combination, practical and vulnerable, made my chest tight. We arrived early and claimed a spot near the center. Rosa was already there, selling honey. She caught my eye and gave a small nod that said she had our backs. For the first hour, nothing happened. Shoppers bought our greens. A few old-timers clapped me on the shoulder with guarded congratulations. Then Caroline Whitmore arrived. She cut through the crowd like a blade through silk. She was in her late 50s, wearing a coat that cost more than most people's monthly feed bill, silver jewelry catching the morning sun. Beside her walked a thin man in a dark suit, her personal attorney, a man I recognized as Gregory Hale. They stopped directly in front of our table. Caroline's voice was pitched to Carrie. "Well, the new Mrs. Vale, I heard you finally found someone willing to take you in. Or should I say, someone whose loneliness made him desperate enough to accept damaged goods." The dozen shoppers within earshot went quiet. I felt Alina stiffen beside me. I opened my mouth to respond, but Alina spoke first. She stepped forward, not in front of me, but directly beside me, shoulder to shoulder. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, her voice steadier than I expected, "you fired me for a theft I didn't commit. You spread lies that cost me my home. And now you're standing here on a Saturday morning trying to ruin my marriage. I sold you 3 dozen jars of pickled beets last summer. Did you think I'd stay scared forever?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Not support, necessarily, but surprise. The woman they'd labeled a desperate orphan was standing her ground. Caroline's smile tightened. "You have no idea what I think, but Gregory here has been reviewing the legal validity of marriages entered into under duress. A homeless woman, a disfigured recluse. It doesn't require much imagination to see this arrangement for what it really is." "And what is that?" I asked, stepping forward now. "Say it clearly so everyone can hear." "Fraud, coercion. She traded herself for a roof and you exploited her vulnerability. Or was it the other way around? Maybe the scarred man needed a woman so badly he pressured a desperate girl. Either way, a judge will want to know." Before I could reply, Father Thomas walked up to our stall. He was in his 60s, balding, with the kind of calm presence that made people pause mid-sentence. He set down a bag of potatoes and looked Caroline directly in the eye. "Mrs. Whitmore, I witnessed that ceremony myself. There was no duress. There was no coercion. There were 2 people who had been failed by this community, taking the first step toward something stable. If you have evidence to the contrary, bring it to the church office. Otherwise, I suggest you let these good people sell their vegetables." Caroline's attorney leaned toward her ear and murmured something. She shook him off. "This isn't over, Father. The county will hear the full story. And when this marriage is annulled and she's back on the street, I'll be the first to offer her a broom and a mop." She turned and stalked away, the crowd parting. When she was gone, a woman named Mrs. Calloway, a widow who ran the bakery, walked up to our table and said, loud enough for everyone, "I'll take 2 dozen eggs and whatever that green squash is." And I don't believe a word Caroline says. Suddenly, business was brisk. People who had been standing back now stepped forward, offering quiet words of support. Alina handled the sales while I bagged the produce, and I watched the color slowly return to her cheeks. But on the drive home, the bravery crumbled. Alina stared out the window, her jaw tight. "She mentioned the county," she said. "She's building a case for annulment. If a judge rules the marriage invalid, everything falls apart. My legal right to stay on the farm, the protection of your name, it all vanishes. I'll be homeless, and you'll be at the center of a public scandal. I pulled the truck to the side of the road and turned to face her. Then we make sure no judge ever believes her. We build a life that looks unambiguously real, not just a performance, a partnership. Alina's eyes searched my face. What does that mean? It means we stop moving through the farm like two people occupying separate corners. We share meals every day, not just when we're too tired to argue. We work the market together every Saturday. I teach you the books. You teach me to cook something that doesn't come out black. We give the town a story they can see. She was quiet for a long moment. Then so softly I almost missed it, she said, I'm afraid of what happens if we succeed. If we actually become what we're pretending to be. What if I lose myself again? I didn't have an answer for that. I wasn't sure I hadn't lost myself years ago, but I put the truck in gear and drove us home. The rhythm of the farm began to change. Alina woke before me, clattering pans in the kitchen, and I'd come downstairs to the smell of fresh biscuits and scrambled eggs that actually tasted like eggs. She took over the garden completely, weeding and staking and harvesting with a focus that bordered on obsession. I found myself inventing reasons to walk past her row of tomatoes just to hear her hum under her breath. At night, we sat in the living room and I read aloud from my mother's books, Steinbeck, Cather, poems by Frost, and Alina would listen with her eyes half closed, her feet tucked under her, the distance between us shrinking one syllable at a time. 2 weeks after the market, Rosa drove out to the farm with a folder clutched to her chest. Her expression was a mixture of triumph and dread. She spread papers across the kitchen table. My cousin works in the county recorder's office, she said. I asked her to pull every property transaction Caroline Whitmore has been involved in for the past 10 years. It took a while, but I found something. She pointed at a deed dated 4 years earlier. It recorded the sale of a 40-acre parcel from an 83-year-old man named Ethan Ruiz to Caroline Whitmore for the sum of $1. Ethan Ruiz had been a neighbor of Caroline's, a widower with no children, and by the time of the sale he had been declining with dementia for 2 years. His signature on the deed looked nothing like the samples on earlier records, shaky, hesitant, the letters barely formed. She got him to sign over his land for nothing, Rosa said. She used that land as collateral to leverage her position at the bank, and that's the same bank that holds your loan. Alina stared at the document. If we can prove the sale was fraudulent, the collateral collapses. The bank loses its reason to call in your loan early, and Caroline loses her leverage over us. If we can prove it, I said, we need more than a questionable signature. We need a witness who knew Ethan during that period, someone who can testify to his mental state. Caroline's lawyers will fight this every step. Rosa leaned forward. I also found something else. Caroline's mortgage on her own estate was refinanced 6 months ago. The terms are predatory, balloon payments, adjustable rates. She's over-leveraged. If the bank pulls its support or demands immediate repayment of her notes, she could lose everything. That's why she's so desperate to control the narrative. She needs the bank's continued backing. The pieces clicked into place. Caroline wasn't just vindictive. She was cornered, and cornered predators bite. Her vendetta against Alina, the firing, the theft accusation, the campaign to annul our marriage, wasn't about a bracelet. It was about power. Albert had humiliated her decades ago, and now his daughter was the nearest target she could strike at to prove her dominance. I stood up from the table. We need to find someone who can testify about Ethan's condition, and we need to move fast. Caroline already knows about our marriage. She's probably already working on the next angle. If she finds out we're digging into her land deals, she'll escalate. That escalation came sooner than I could have predicted. 3 nights later, the storm hit. It was a brute of a storm. The kind that rolls down from the Cascades without warning and turns the valley into a roar of wind and rain. I spent the afternoon boarding up the barn and securing the chicken coop. Alina helped me drag tools inside and fill every bucket with water in case the power went. By dusk, the rain was coming sideways, and the old oak near the fence line was groaning under the force. I ordered Alina to stay inside. She ignored me. When the chicken coop door blew open and half the flock scattered into the darkness, she bolted into the yard without hesitation. I shouted her name over the wind, but she was already ankle-deep in mud, trying to herd terrified birds back toward shelter. Then I heard the crack, a sound that went through my spine like a gunshot. I looked up and saw the thickest branch of that old oak splintering free, 30 feet of wood and weight plunging toward where Alina stood. Time collapsed. I don't remember running. I remember the impact of my shoulder against her body, the two of us tumbling through mud and wet grass as the branch hit the ground with a concussion that vibrated through my bones. I ended up above her, arms braced on either side of her head, rain lashing down. She was clutching a chicken to her chest, her eyes wide, her breath coming in ragged gasps. I was shaking not with cold but with the realization of how close I'd come to losing her. "Are you insane?" I shouted. "A chicken. You nearly died over a chicken." She looked up at me, rainwater streaming down her face, and said, "I couldn't let them die. I've lost too much already." Something broke inside me. I kissed her, not the careful, chaste brush from the courthouse, a fierce, desperate kiss that held every suppressed moment of the past weeks. And she kissed me back, her free hand tangling in my wet hair, pulling me closer. Lightning split the sky, and for those seconds the storm didn't exist. When we finally broke apart, we were both trembling. I helped her to her feet and we stumbled inside, soaked and breathless. I grabbed a blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders, then turned away while she changed into dry clothes. When I turned back, she was wearing my flannel shirt, her hair dark with water, her expression unreadable. She didn't move toward her room. Neither did I that night. The separate rooms became a formality we no longer observed. I woke before dawn with Alina's back pressed against my chest and the scent of rain still lingering in the air. For a few minutes I lay completely still, afraid that any movement would shatter whatever spell had settled over us. Then she stirred, turned in my arms, and looked at me. Her face was soft, unguarded in a way I had never seen. "Good morning, husband," she whispered. The word no longer felt like a legal fiction. It felt like the truest thing I owned. But the morning light also revealed the storm's damage. Part of the barn roof torn away, 2 fence sections down, 4 chickens dead. Alina stood beside the coop, arms wrapped around herself, and said, "I'm sorry. If I hadn't run out there, maybe none of this would have happened." I put my hands on her shoulders. "You saved 2 of them and you're still alive. That's the only math that matters." Later that afternoon, Sebastian arrived with worse news. He found us in the barn where I was nailing a tarp over the gap in the roof. His face was grave. "Caroline made her move," he said. "The bank has called in your loan, full balance due in 2 weeks, $30,000. She's been pressuring them for days, and now that someone at the county is questioning the validity of your marriage, they say you're a credit risk." Alina went pale. "We don't have that kind of money." "No," Sebastian said. "But if you default, she can buy the farm at auction. That's her endgame. She doesn't just want to humiliate you, she wants your land." That night, Alina and I sat under the maple tree where her father had once made me promise to protect her. The scar on the trunk from the broken branch was raw and pale. She held my hand tightly. "If she takes the farm," she said, "we lose everything." I pulled her against my side. "She won't take it. We have Rosa's document. If we can prove the Ruiz sale was fraudulent, we can file an emergency motion to block the foreclosure, but we need a witness, someone who knew Ethan Ruiz before the dementia." Alina was silent for a moment, then she sat up straight. "Mrs. Calloway, the baker. Her late husband was Ethan's doctor. She might have records. She might have known him personally." We drove into town early the next morning. Mrs. Calloway's bakery was warm and smelled of cinnamon. She listened to our story without interruption, then disappeared into a back room. She returned carrying a small cardboard box. Inside were medical records from her husband's practice, including a neurological assessment dated 6 months before the land sale, documenting Ethan's advanced dementia and his inability to understand complex transactions. "I've been holding on to these," Mrs. Calloway said. "I didn't know what to do with them, but Caroline never should have gotten that land. If these can help you, take them." That evidence was our weapon, but Caroline must have sensed the ground shifting, because that very night, around 2 in the morning, I heard movement near the barn. I got up at once. Alina woke too. This time, I didn't try to stop her from coming. We moved down the stairs together, me carrying a length of pipe, her holding the flashlight. At the barn, 3 figures were splashing something along the base of the wall. The smell reached us before the sound, gasoline, sharp and unmistakable. I raised the flashlight and shouted. One of them spun around, and in the beam of light I recognized Brad Miller, a local handyman known for taking odd jobs that paid cash and asked no questions. His eyes went wide with panic. "Matthew, this isn't personal," he stammered. "Caroline's paying triple. She just wants the barn, not the house, just the barn." Before I could respond, headlights appeared on the road. Sebastian's truck, followed by 3 other vehicles. He had seen unfamiliar cars parked on the county road and had rallied the neighbors. Within minutes, Brad and his accomplices were surrounded. 2 of them bolted into the dark, but Brad stayed, too scared to run, too guilty to fight. By sunrise, he was sitting in the back of the sheriff's car, giving a full confession. Brad's confession spilled out in the back of the sheriff's car, shaky and fragmented but unmistakably clear. Caroline Whitmore had paid him $2,000 in cash to burn our barn to the ground. She had told him the storm would cover any noise, the wet ground would contain the fire, and if anyone asked questions, he could say he was just passing through. The sheriff, a tired man named Paulson who had been dealing with Caroline's complaints for years, took down every word. By the time the sun rose over the muddy yard, Brad was facing charges of attempted arson and conspiracy, and the other 2 men were being tracked by deputies through the back roads. I stood in the kitchen doorway with Alina pressed against my side, watching the patrol car disappear down the gravel drive. The immediate danger was over, but I knew Caroline wouldn't let this end with a handyman's confession. She had too many resources, too much pride, and far too much to lose. First counterpunch landed before noon. Gregory Hale, Caroline's attorney, appeared at the sheriff's office demanding to see Brad's statement. Within an hour, a press release went out from Caroline's estate. She denied any involvement, called the accusations the desperate fabrications of a disgraced employee and her opportunist husband, and announced that she was considering a defamation lawsuit against us. The local paper ran the headline, "Whitmore accuses neighbors of framing her in barn fire plot." The town split down the middle. Half the people who had bought vegetables from our stall now crossed the street when they saw me coming. The other half, Rosa, Father Thomas, Sebastian, Mrs. Calloway, doubled down on their support, but support doesn't pay a $30,000 loan. The second blow came in a registered letter the following afternoon. The bank was moving forward with the foreclosure, effective immediately. The arson attempt, the pending investigation, the question over our marriage's validity, none of it mattered. Caroline's pressure had frozen any goodwill the bank might have extended. We had 10 days to produce the full balance or the farm would be auctioned on the courthouse steps. I read the letter 3 times, the words blurring into a single, suffocating threat. Alina sat at the kitchen table, her face pale, the ring on her finger catching the afternoon light. "We have the evidence," she said quietly. "The medical records from Mrs. Calloway. If we can prove the Ruiz sale was fraudulent, the collateral Caroline used to influence the bank becomes void. They'd have to cancel the foreclosure." "That's a civil case," I said. "It takes weeks, maybe months to get before a judge. We have 10 days. "Then we file for an emergency injunction," Sebastian said from the doorway. He had driven out the moment he heard the news. "If we can show immediate and irreparable harm, which, Matthew, losing your family's farm certainly qualifies, we can ask the court to freeze the foreclosure until the fraud case is resolved. But we need more than medical records. We need a living witness who can swear that Ethan Ruiz didn't understand what he was signing." Mrs. Calloway had mentioned a name when she handed over the box, Delia Herrera, the private nurse who had cared for Ethan during his final 2 years. We found her living 30 miles away in a single-wide trailer at the edge of a state park. She was in her early 60s, with strong hands and wary eyes that had seen too many rich people dispose of too many inconvenient truths. When we explained why we were there, she led us inside and poured coffee, her expression unreadable. "I remember the day that deed was signed," she said. "I was in the kitchen making lunch. Caroline came to the house with a notary, a man named Womack, and they sat at Ethan's bedside. He kept asking for his wife, who had been dead for 6 years. He didn't know what year it was. He thought Caroline was his sister. I told her right there that he was in no condition to sign anything. She told me to mind my own business, and Mr. Womack stamped the document without a word. I wrote down everything that happened in my personal journal that night. I still have it. Alina leaned forward. Would you be willing to testify? In court under oath. Delia was silent for a long moment. She looked at the floor, at her hands, at the window where the rain from the recent storm still beaded on the glass. Caroline Whitmore got one of my colleagues blacklisted from every care facility in 3 counties just for questioning a prescription she wanted. If I testify against her, I lose everything. My license, my income, my reputation. She'll destroy me. I understood that fear. I had lived with the weight of other people's judgments for years. We won't ask you to do it alone, I said. We'll have legal support. There will be other witnesses. The more people who stand up, the harder it is for her to silence all of them. Delia met my eyes. You really think you can beat her? I've seen men with more money and power than you try. They end up bankrupt, broken, or gone. I've already lost my face, I said, and I refuse to lose the woman I love. If you can help us, we'll protect you however we can. She didn't agree that day, but 2 days later she called. Her trailer had been vandalized overnight, windows smashed, tires slashed, a warning note taped to the door. The note was unsigned, but its message was clear: stay quiet. The attack, intended to silence her, had the opposite effect. I'll testify, she told me, her voice shaking with anger. If that woman wants a fight, I'll give her one. While we were securing Delia's testimony, Caroline launched her third assault, and this one struck at the heart of what Alina and I had built. Gregory Hale filed an emergency motion with the county court to annul our marriage. The argument was legally precise and emotionally brutal. Alina had been homeless, jobless, facing imminent destitution. Matthew was a disfigured recluse who had been isolated from society for years. The marriage, the motion claimed, was a transaction born of desperation on one side and exploitation on the other. Even if we now claim to have genuine feelings, the original compact was void under the doctrine of duress. If the annulment was granted, Alina would lose her legal standing in the property dispute. She would be a trespasser on my land, and my loan, already accelerated, would be my crisis alone to face. The motion landed on our doorstep the same morning Delia's trailer was attacked. I read it standing in the driveway, Alina beside me. When I finished, she took the paper from my hands and read it herself. Then she looked up, her eyes dry but blazing. They're trying to erase us, she said. Not just the farm, us. Then we don't let them, I said. We go to the courthouse and we file our own motion. We show the evidence of the fraudulent land sale. We show the connection to the bank's foreclosure. We argue that Caroline is not a disinterested party. She's an adversary actively trying to destroy us so she can seize the land, and we testify together that this marriage is real. Alina reached up and touched my scarred cheek. It is real, she whispered. Whatever it started as, it's real now. I covered her hand with mine. Then we fight for it. Sebastian drove us to the county courthouse, a granite building with wide steps and the smell of old paper. Rosa met us there, carrying another folder. This one containing depositions from 3 other people Caroline had wronged over the years. A farmer she had cheated out of a water rights agreement. A shopkeeper she had driven out of business by spreading rumors about his family. A former housekeeper who claimed Caroline had accused her of stealing identical to Alina's story, and who had later won a quiet settlement after threatening to sue. The pattern was undeniable, and Rosa had pieced it together with the tenacity of a woman who refused to let her friend be destroyed. We filed for an emergency injunction to halt the foreclosure, presenting the Ruiz medical records, Delia's journal, the testimony of the vandalism, Brad's confession, and Rosa's collected depositions. The filing argued that Caroline Whitmore was engaged in a coordinated campaign of fraud, intimidation, and criminal conspiracy, and that the bank's foreclosure action was a direct instrument of that campaign. We requested an expedited hearing before any judge without ties to the Whitmore family. The clerk stamped the documents and told us to come back the following morning for a ruling on the injunction. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay beside Alina, listening to the wind move through the damaged oak, and I counted the hours. If the injunction was denied, the auction would proceed. If the auction proceeded, the farm was gone, and with it the only stability either of us had ever known. Morning came cold and gray. We dressed in our best clothes, the same white shirt I'd worn to the wedding, the same blue dress Alina had worn to honor her mother, and drove back to the courthouse. The waiting room was already crowded when we arrived. I saw Gregory Hale in an immaculate suit, speaking quietly with a bank representative. I saw Father Thomas in his clerical collar, seated on a bench with his hands folded. I saw Mrs. Calloway and Delia, their faces tight with nerves. And I saw Caroline Whitmore herself, arriving in a black sedan, flanked by 2 aides. She didn't look at us. She walked through the metal detectors like a queen entering a court she already controlled. Judge Fernando Reyes was not the judge any of us had expected. He was new to the circuit, a man in his early 40s with a reputation for fairness and a low tolerance for legal theatrics. When he called the case, his voice was calm but carried weight. Hale argued first, laying out Caroline's position with cold precision. The marriage was a sham, the arson accusations were retaliatory fiction, and the foreclosure was a straightforward financial matter that had nothing to do with any land deals. He moved to dismiss our injunction and let the bank proceed. Then our turn came. I stood beside Alina, our attorney, a young public defender named Claudia who had volunteered after hearing about the case from Rosa, presented the documents one by one. The medical records, Delia's journal, the depositions, Brad's confession. And at the end, Alina stepped forward and spoke, her voice clear and unwavering. "This marriage is not a transaction," she said. "I came to Matthew with nothing but fear and a father's dying request. He gave me a roof and asked for nothing in return. What grew between us is real. Every meal I cooked, every row I planted, every night I fell asleep with his arm around me, that wasn't duress, that was love. If this court annuls our marriage, it won't be protecting me. It will be handing Caroline Whitmore the victory she's been trying to steal for months." The room went still. Judge Reyes looked at the evidence spread before him, then at Caroline, then at Alina and me. He didn't rule immediately. He said he would need time to review, but that in light of the serious criminal allegations, he was issuing a temporary stay on the foreclosure until a full evidentiary hearing could be held. The hearing, he announced, would be public and would convene in exactly 1 week. All parties would be expected to appear, and all witnesses would be subject to cross-examination. "If what you've presented is true," he said, looking directly at me, "then this is not merely a property dispute. This is a matter of profound injustice that this court will not ignore." Caroline's face drained of color. For the first time, I saw something other than arrogance in her expression: fear. Real, visceral fear. Gregory Hale whispered urgently in her ear, but she shook him off and stood, her hands gripping the table in front of her. "This is a travesty," she said, her voice tight. "You're taking the word of a scarred hermit and a thief over a woman who has supported this community for decades." Judge Reyes looked at her without pity. "You'll have your chance to present your evidence, Mrs. Whitmore, but I suggest you come prepared. The allegations against you are serious, and if proven, they carry consequences that no amount of money can erase." The gavel came down, and the hearing was adjourned. Outside the courthouse, the cold air hit my face and I breathed it in like reprieve. Alina threw her arms around me, and I held her while Rosa cried and Sebastian pumped his fist toward the sky. But even in that moment of victory, I felt the weight of the coming week. Caroline would not surrender. She would use every connection, every dollar, every dirty trick left in her arsenal. The real battle was just beginning, and at the center of that battle was a truth none of us had fully unearthed yet. A 30-year-old wound that had festered long before my accident, long before Alina lost her job, long before Albert Morris asked me to protect his daughter. Because Caroline's hatred wasn't random. It was aimed, personal, and older than any of us understood. The week ahead would tear that secret out of the dark, and when it did, nothing in Wheatland would ever be the same. The week leading up to the hearing was the longest of my life. Every day brought a new anxiety, a new rumor spread by Caroline's allies, a new legal filing from Hale designed to exhaust us, a new moment where I woke in the dark and wondered if we were about to lose everything. But we didn't stop. Mrs. Calloway spent hours going through her late husband's records, finding additional notes that confirmed Ethan Ruiz lacked capacity months before the sale. Delia rehearsed her testimony with Claudia until her voice was steady and her eyes held fire. Rosa kept digging, and 3 days before the hearing she uncovered the final piece, a notary's log from Womack's office that showed the Ruiz deed notarization had been backdated by 4 weeks, to a date when Ethan was hospitalized for pneumonia and couldn't possibly have signed anything. It was fraud on top of fraud, and the notary himself was now willing to testify in exchange for immunity. Meanwhile, I watched Alina transform. The trembling woman who had stood on my porch clutching her coat had become someone else, a woman who walked the farm with her shoulders back, who met my eyes without flinching, who whispered, "We're going to win," into my chest at night. We slept in the same bed now, not out of convenience but out of need. The night before the hearing, she traced the scar on my chest with her fingertips and said, "This isn't a mark of shame. It's a map of how far you've come. And tomorrow, everyone else is going to see it too." The town hall was packed. Folding chairs had been set up in rows and every seat was filled. People I hadn't seen in years, old farmers, shopkeepers, the librarian, the mechanic, had come to witness what felt like the trial of the decade. Caroline sat in the front row with Gregory Hale, dressed in a navy suit that tried and failed to mask the tension in her jaw. Across the aisle, Delia sat with Mrs. Calloway, Rosa, and Sebastian. Father Thomas was there, a quiet sentinel near the back. And Alina and I sat at a table with Claudia, the evidence spread before us like a deck of cards we were about to play. Judge Reyes entered and the room fell silent. He began by summarizing the multiple matters before him: the annulment petition, the foreclosure injunction, the fraud allegations, and the criminal charges arising from the arson attempt. He then called the first witness, Delia Herrera. Delia walked to the stand with the same quiet dignity I'd seen in her trailer. She described Ethan's last 2 years in vivid detail: his confusion, his grief, his inability to recognize his own reflection. She described the day Caroline came with a notary and how Ethan had called her sister and asked when his wife would be home. "I told Mrs. Whitmore he couldn't sign," Delia said, her voice clear. "She told me to leave the room. When I refused, she had Womack notarize the document while I stood in the doorway. I wrote it all down that night because I knew it was wrong." Hale cross-examined her, trying to suggest she was a disgruntled employee. Delia didn't flinch. "I'm not disgruntled," she said. "I'm angry that a dying man was robbed of his land." Next came the notary, a nervous man named Richard Womack, who admitted under oath that Caroline had pressured him to backdate the deed, offering him a bonus for his discretion. His testimony, combined with the forged logbook, tore the legal foundation out from under Caroline's property claim. Then Alina took the stand. I watched her walk to the front of the room, her mother's dress replaced by a simple blue blouse, her hair pinned back. Claudia asked her gently about the marriage. Alina's voice started soft, then grew. "I married Matthew because I had no other choice," she said. "I was homeless, accused of a crime I didn't commit, and everyone in this town was ready to believe the worst of me. But the moment I walked into that farmhouse, something shifted. He didn't look at me like a burden. He looked at me like a person worth saving, and over the weeks cooking meals, weeding gardens, sitting in silence, I fell in love with him. I'm not with him because I'm desperate. I'm with him because he's the first man who's ever made me feel whole." I felt the words land in my chest like stones. Across the room, Caroline's face tightened. When it was my turn, I didn't need a rehearsed statement. I spoke from the scar and the silence. My face scared people away for years. I thought I'd spend the rest of my life alone. Alina didn't see the scar. She saw me. That's not duress. That's a miracle. Hale attempted to paint us as conspirators, suggesting we'd invented the love story to save the farm. But when Claudia introduced the evidence of the arson, Brad's confession, the sheriff's report, testimony from the neighbors who'd arrived that night, the momentum shifted irreversibly. Brad himself testified, pale and ashamed, detailing the $2,000, the gasoline, Caroline's explicit instructions. By the time the prosecution rested, Gregory Hale looked like a man who knew he was representing a sinking ship. And then came the final revelation, the secret I had sensed but never fully understood. Claudia called Father Thomas to testify about Caroline's history with Albert Morris. The priest rose slowly, his voice heavy with the weight of years. He told the court that 30 years ago, Caroline had been a young woman of means who had set her sights on Albert. She had expected him to marry her, to elevate her status, to give her the life she believed she deserved. Albert had refused her gently but firmly, and instead married Alina's mother, a woman of humble origins but immense heart. Caroline had never forgiven him. She had spent 3 decades nursing that wound, undermining Albert where she could, spreading rumors and waiting for the moment she could finally destroy everything he had built. When Albert died, that hatred transferred to Alina. She told me once, Father Thomas said, that if she couldn't have Albert, she would make sure his legacy was nothing but ash. I didn't believe her then. I do now. The silence in the room was absolute. Caroline sat rigid, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. The town was learning that the woman they had feared and deferred to for years had been driven not by power, but by a pathetic, decades-old rejection. Judge Reyes took a long breath. Then he spoke, his words slow and deliberate. The court finds that the marriage between Matthew Vale and Alina Morris Vale is lawful, valid, and entered into with full consent. The annulment petition is denied. A gasp went through the room. Alina grabbed my hand. Reyes continued. The court further finds that the property transfer from Ethan Ruiz to Caroline Whitmore was fraudulent and is hereby declared null and void. The collateral Ms. Whitmore used to pressure the bank is dissolved. The foreclosure on Mr. Vale's farm is permanently enjoined. The loan is reinstated under its original terms. Caroline shot to her feet, her composure shattering. "This is an outrage. I built this town," she screamed. Judge Reyes was unmoved. "You are also facing charges of criminal conspiracy, arson, and fraud. Those will be addressed in a separate proceeding. For now, this hearing is adjourned." The gavel fell and the room erupted. Rosa was crying, Sebastian was laughing, Mrs. Calloway was hugging Delia. Caroline stood in the chaos, her face pale, her empire crumbling around her. She turned and walked out of the hall alone, her heels echoing in the sudden silence that trailed her departure. Outside, the sun was setting over the fields, turning the wheat gold. Alina and I stood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by friends and neighbors who had come to our side. Father Thomas placed a hand on my shoulder. "Albert would be proud," he said. "You kept your promise." That night, a small gathering formed in the town square, not organized, just organic, as if the whole community needed to exhale. There was music, food, children running between the legs of adults. I danced with Alina under strings of lights that someone had hung between the wooden posts, and for the first time in my life I didn't care who saw my scar. I only cared about the woman in my arms. "You didn't need a wife," she whispered, looking up at me. "You needed exactly me." I pulled her closer. "And you needed exactly me. That's the only math that matters." 6 months later, the farm had transformed. Alina's garden became the most popular stall at the market, selling out every Saturday. We paid off the reinstated loan ahead of schedule, fixed the barn roof, added goats and a new flock of chickens. Caroline Whitmore's trial resulted in a conviction on fraud and conspiracy charges. Her estate was seized and sold to cover restitution. The new owners, a young family from the valley, turned her mansion into a community center and orchard. Delia became the director of elder care at the county hospital, and Mrs. Calloway's bakery thrived on word of mouth and goodwill. And Alina and I, we didn't just survive, we built a life. One spring morning, she found me in the garden, took my hand and pressed it to her stomach. "We're going to have a baby," she said. I lifted her off the ground and spun her in the middle of the tomato rows while she laughed and cried at the same time. That evening we sat under the old maple tree, now healed from its storm wound. I had carved our initials into a new bench, M and E intertwined. Alina rested her head on my shoulder and looked out at the wheat field. "My father was right," she said. "You needed a partner." I kissed her hair. "No, I needed a reason to stop hiding, and you gave me one. But the story doesn't end there. Because on the day our son was born, Albert Morris Vale, a healthy boy with his mother's eyes and his grandfather's name, I held him in my arms and realized that the fence I'd fixed that day had not just repaired a boundary between two properties. It had dismantled the walls around two hearts, and the quiet supper that followed had become a legacy, one that would outlast scars, graves, and every storm the valley could throw at us. I think about that supper often now. A broken fence, a pot of coffee, a table set for two after 10 years of silence. It seemed like such a small thing at the time. Just a meal, just a conversation, just two people too wounded to know how to ask for what they needed. But small things, I've learned, are rarely small. They're the cracks where the light gets in. When Albert Morris made me promise to look after Alina, I thought he was asking me to provide shelter. I didn't understand he was asking me to tear down the walls I'd built around myself. For 6 years, I had hidden behind my scar, convinced that my face was a billboard for everything I'd lost. I let the whispers and the stares drive me into a solitude so complete I forgot what it felt like to be touched without pity. Alina walked into that darkness with me, not as a savior, but as a fellow refugee. She had lost her father, her reputation, her home, and still she found the courage to set a table and whisper an invitation. That invitation became a marriage, then a partnership, then a love I never expected to deserve. It became a fight we nearly lost, a community that rallied around us, and a justice that felt less like victory than like breathing after nearly drowning. And it became a child, our son Albert, who will grow up on this land knowing that his name carries the weight of a man who believed in second chances. Caroline Whitmore's hatred was a black hole, and it swallowed her whole. I take no pleasure in that. She spent 30 years nursing a wound that existed only in her own mind, and in the end, the only legacy she left was a cautionary tale. The town learned something from her, though something about the cost of silence, the danger of letting one powerful voice drown out all the others. When people finally stood up, they didn't just save my farm. They reclaimed their own dignity. I'm not naive enough to think every story ends this way. There are plenty of Carolines in the world, and plenty of people like me and Alina who are one bad storm away from losing everything. But I believe now that the smallest gestures can tip the balance. A fence mended, a meal offered, a promise kept. None of it seems dramatic in the moment, but that's the point. The dramatic moments only happen because someone first had the courage to do something quiet and ordinary and terrifying, to stay. If you're watching this, maybe you're in your own season of silence. Maybe you're wondering if the walls you've built are protecting you or just keeping you from the life you were meant to live. I can't answer that for you. I can only tell you what happened when a woman who'd been broken by grief looked at a man who'd been broken by a tractor blade, and both of them decided to risk one more meal together. It changed everything. So here's what I ask. The next time you have a chance to mend a fence, literal or otherwise, don't turn away. The next time someone sets a table and whispers a quiet invitation, accept it. You never know what legacy might begin with a single supper. Thank you for listening to our story. If it meant something to you, share it with someone who might need to hear that second chances are real. And if you want more stories of ordinary people who found extraordinary strength, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. This is Matthew Vale from the farm outside Wheatland, reminding you that no scar is too deep, no silence too long, and no fence too broken to be rebuilt.